A trail of blood cut through the untouched snow, a stark confession etched in scarlet. Through the fury of the Texas blizzard, Grace Mitchell peered into the whiteout, her headlights illuminating something that simply had no place there. In a world where death should have reigned, there was movement. 19 degrees below zero, a storm for the history books. Anything left to the cold was meant to perish. But not her. There, half buried in a snowdrift, a German shepherd lay collapsed, her swollen abdomen rising and falling with desperate, labored breaths. With every agonizing exhale, ice crystals bloomed on her muzzle. Yet as Grace knelt beside her, it wasn't just the sight of this expectant mother clinging to life that made her hands tremble. It was what the dog Aurora was clutching to her chest, with such desperate paws, a faded pink backpack, tragically small, just the right size for a little girl. It was embroidered with delicate butterflies and a single name that caused Grace's own heart to falter. Emily. As Grace reached for the bag, Aurora's eyes shot open. A low growl rumbled from deep within her chest, a sound that echoed with promises forged in shadow and a vow she would not break. It was a sound of guardianship that seemed to defy death itself. What secret did this bag hold that a dying dog would defend it with her last breath before we uncover the truth? Please take a moment to like this video and share in the comments which city you're joining us from. And now, back to the mystery in the snow. Grace Mitchell understood that sorrow carved out voids in a person that time could never fully mend. 5 years earlier, the choice of a drunk driver had stolen her 8-year-old daughter from her daughter Lily. It left Grace with a veterinary practice that now felt less like a calling and more like a constant quiet penance. Now 35, she resided in the solitude above her clinic on the fringes of Austin, where the city gave way to sprawling ranch land and neighbors kept to themselves. The great February storm of 2021 had warped this familiar world into a hostile alien landscape. The power lines were down. The roads had become impassable. All of Texas was shattering under a weight of ice it was never designed to endure. The rabies tag identified her as Aurora, just 5 years old. A German shepherd who should have been in the absolute prime of her life. But instead she was little more than bones and old scars hidden beneath a coat of matted fur. 7 deep wounds scarred her back, too deliberate, too precise. They were methodical. The kind of injuries that didn't happen by accident, but spoke of a calculated human darkness. And she was heavily pregnant, perhaps only days away from giving birth. Grace could only wonder what kind of monster would cast a mother-to-be out into the most brutal storm in the history of Texas. Just 3 miles from where Grace knelt in the snow, the house of Frank Donovan stood as a crumbling monument to neglect and decay. Frank, a master builder whose hands had raised half the homes in town, had been idle since February 14, 2018, the day his 7-year-old daughter Emily was swallowed by a winter storm. All the police ever found was her pink backpack near the creek, but never her. The search lasted a mere 72 hours before it was abandoned. Emily would be 10 now if the world had any room left for miracles. Instead, Frank existed in a fog of bourbon and self-reproach, his sole companion the dog he had once bought for his daughter. The very dog he blamed for failing to bring his little girl home. Margaret Henderson, Maggie to the whole town, had observed it all from the vantage of her kitchen window. At 72, she'd outlasted a husband, 2 sons, and harbored more secrets than any soul should bear. She knew things about that night 3 years prior, things about footprints left in the snow, about travelers who were just passing through, and about a child's cry she was sure she'd heard carried on the frigid wind. But Maggie knew that some truths needed time to ripen, like fruit on a vine. Revealed too soon, they would only poison everyone who heard them. The storm raging outside Grace's clinic howled with an unnatural fury, as if nature itself was clawing away 3 years of silence and snow. Grace was on her way back from an emergency call. Old Man Murphy's horse had been suffering from colic, though it hadn't survived the night. That's when her headlights slashed across the blood. Stark crimson against pure white, a stain impossible to miss, even as the snow swirled in blinding sheets. She pulled over, a decision made against her better judgment. The wind hit her face like shattered glass as she opened the door, and she had to shield her eyes with her hand just to follow the dark trail. Aurora lay there, a question mark curled against the finality of death. Her body was protectively wrapped around that pink backpack, as if it held the last warmth on Earth. Grace's veterinary training took over in an instant. The dog's breathing was perilously shallow, dangerously rapid, maybe 30 respirations per minute. Hypothermia, shock, and advanced pregnancy. The calculation was both simple and brutal. Aurora had an hour at most, maybe less if Grace didn't move fast. "Easy now, girl," Grace whispered, reaching out with a slow, cautious hand. Aurora's amber eyes opened, clouded with agony, but still sharp with a fierce purpose. The moment Grace's hand shifted toward the bag, Aurora bared her teeth, a growl rumbling from somewhere far deeper than her throat. It was the sound of the vow, unbroken. Grace paused, shifting her strategy. She carefully draped her own coat over Aurora's shivering form, making sure to leave the tattered bag untouched. The dog accepted the warmth, a flicker of gratitude in her weary eyes, yet her paws remained locked around those frayed straps. Moving Aurora into the truck consumed 20 agonizing minutes Grace couldn't spare, the dog weighing perhaps 60 pounds when she should have been 80, and each careful shift drew a pained whimper that resonated deep in Grace's soul. Once they were back at the clinic, Grace moved with practiced urgency, administering intravenous fluids, wrapping her in warming blankets, and starting a course of antibiotics. The ultrasound revealed at least 5 tiny lives, perhaps more, their heartbeats faint but persistent. Aurora would need an emergency C-section immediately, but even as the powerful sedatives began to take effect, her grip on the bag never wavered. Grace had seen dogs hold on to favorite toys, but this was something else entirely. This was a loyalty so profound it defied consciousness itself. While preparing Aurora for the surgery, Grace took a somber inventory of her injuries. The 7 scars across her back were cruelly methodical, left by a belt or maybe a switch. Beneath the surface, old ribs had mended incorrectly, and a shoulder bore the signs of a past dislocation. This poor animal had endured years of unspeakable cruelty, and yet when Grace's assistant, Tommy, attempted to shift the backpack a mere 6 inches to clear space for the equipment, Aurora's eyes shot open. Through the fog of sedation, her jaw closed around Tommy's wrist, not with enough force to draw blood, but with a pressure that sent an unmistakable message: the bag stays. They proceeded with the surgery, the worn backpack nestled securely against Aurora's side. Long after midnight, with Aurora finally in a profound sleep, Grace felt she could at last inspect the bag. The clinic was hushed, a stark contrast to the raging storm outside, the silence punctuated only by the gentle rhythm of the monitors. Grace gently pulled the zipper, feeling like an intruder stepping into a sacred, sorrowful space. What lay inside was a child's entire world, somehow compressed and perfectly preserved. A small cloth doll, lovingly handmade with hair of yellow yarn, and a dress fashioned from what appeared to be curtain material. One of its button eyes was gone. Tucked beside it was a photograph, its edges torn, and the image blurred by water damage, revealing only fragments of a forgotten moment, the curve of a child's smile, the soft edge of a dog's muzzle, and a tiny knitted scarf. It was lavender and white, with dropped stitches that were a testament to a child's eager hands, and at the bottom a tiny square folded as neatly as a secret, a page torn from a notebook. Beneath the intense glare of the surgical light, Grace's fingers carefully unfolded it, revealing a child's handwriting, deliberate and round. "Aurora, keep me safe until I come back. You promised you would never leave me. I love you more than all the stars, Emily." Grace leaned back, the paper trembling in her grasp. Emily Donovan, the little girl who had vanished 3 years ago. The same girl whose father lived just 3 miles away in a house that reeked of bourbon and regret. This was no ordinary stray with a backpack. This was a guardian bound by a sacred duty on a mission that had endured for longer than anyone could ever imagine. In her medicated sleep, Aurora let out a soft whimper, her paws twitching as if reaching for something that was no longer there. For Emily, it was as if she whispered the name a sound dogs could not make. Emily. Over and over, a name that had become a prayer, a solemn promise, a heavy penance. Grace pulled a chair close to Aurora's recovery cage, setting the pink backpack just outside a silent beacon for the dog to see the moment she awoke. Outside, the storm raged with a new fury, the power lines groaning beneath the crushing weight of the ice. The clinic's generator roared to life as the main power failed, plunging them into a darkness punctuated only by the faint glow of emergency lights and medical monitors. Grace knew then that she had stumbled into something far deeper than a simple rescue. This was about promises that outlive abandonment, about a loyalty that had weathered cruelty, and about a love so profound that not even death itself could extinguish its flame. The real question wasn't why Aurora protected the bag. It was what terrible fate had befallen the little girl who'd asked her to. 7 days had passed since Grace rescued Aurora from the snow, and the relentless storm had only grown more vicious. Texas was breaking, collapsing under a weight of ice it was never meant to bear. The power had been gone for 3 straight days, and Grace's generator sputtered, burning through its last reserves of fuel. She had to move her surgical recovery area to the only warm room left. Clustering Aurora together with 2 other animals, she was boarding all of them refugees from the unforgiving storm. Against all odds, Aurora's body was mending with incredible speed, though she moved with the cautious deliberation of a creature who knew that sudden movements brought agonizing pain. She'd started to arrange her blankets into a peculiar pattern, and always that pink backpack rested at the very center, a sacred rite of motherhood whose motions were forgotten, but whose meaning was etched into her soul. Grace had seen German shepherds nest before, but never like this. This wasn't instinct. It was architecture, each movement deliberate, tinged with a heart-wrenching desperation. A violent pounding shattered the quiet of the clinic at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, though the storm-blackened sky had bled the day into a premature midnight. Even before she reached for the handle, Grace knew. The sour scent of bourbon was already seeping through the wood of the door, followed by the muffled, slurred curses that had become Frank Donovan's calling card. "Where's my damn dog?" he snarled, his hulking frame filling the doorway. He swayed on his feet, a ghost of the man he was his construction worker's build, still imposing despite 3 long years of self-destruction. Tiny ice crystals clung to the rough stubble of his beard, and his eyes were a bloodshot atlas of sorrow and regret. "I know she's in here," he rasped. "Tommy saw you, down at the liquor store." "Mr. Donovan," Grace countered, her voice sharp. "You need to leave." Grace's voice remained a mask of professional calm, even as her fingers discreetly found her phone. "Aurora is recovering from a critical surgery. She was on the brink of death when I brought her in." "Aurora," Frank let out a laugh, a bitter, jagged sound like shattering glass. "Is that what you're calling her now? Her name is Dog. Been that way for 3 years. Just Dog." He shoved past Grace's guard, his heavy steps stumbling into the sterile quiet of the clinic. The cloying stench of stale bourbon cigarettes and neglect immediately suffocated the small space. From the recovery room, a sound tore through the silence, a high, thin wail of pure terror that Grace had never heard from Aurora, raising the hair on her arms. Frank heard it too, and a dark, unreadable emotion flickered in his eyes. Was it satisfaction, guilt? Perhaps both. "She knows her daddy's here." Frank slurred a grim twist to his lips. As he lurched toward the sound, Grace stepped to block his path. "She's terrified of you. What did you do to her?" "What did I do?" Frank's face contorted into a mask of anguish. "You're asking the wrong question. It's what did she do 3 years ago, my little girl, my Emily." His voice shattered as he spoke her name. She was meant to be her protector. We got her to keep Emily safe. His voice rose thick with grief. So where was she when my baby needed her most? Where was she? His roar seemed to echo in the recovery room, as Aurora's panicked cries grew louder, followed by the sickening sound of her body thrashing against the cage. She's going to tear her stitches, Grace warned, her voice hardening. Mr. Donovan, get out now or I am calling the sheriff. He scoffed. The sheriff? Frank let out another harsh laugh. You really believe someone's coming out in this blizzard? You think anyone gives a damn about a broken-down drunk and his dog? He took another threatening step, and Grace saw his knuckles turn white. That animal watched my little girl die. She was only 7 years old. 7. He raised a trembling hand, ticking off the years on his fingers with a drunkard's awful precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 years is all I had. For 7 years she was my entire world. And that dog... Just then, the door flew open, unleashing a vortex of snow and revealing Margaret Henderson. All 4'11" of her was swallowed by a coat that had clearly belonged to her late husband. At 72, Maggie moved with the deliberate force of someone who had buried too much to be afraid of anything left living. Franklin Donovan, she stated, and the sound of his full name on her lips was like the sharp crack of a whip. You're finished here. Frank swayed as he turned. Maggie, what are you... She marched right up to him, forced to crane her neck to meet his volatile gaze, and whispered something Grace couldn't possibly hear. All the color drained from Frank's face. He looked as though he'd been struck by a divine hand. You don't know. He stammered, his voice suddenly weak. You weren't there. I know more than you think, Maggie countered calmly. And if you don't leave this instant, if you don't haul yourself home and sober up, I will tell this entire town what I know, including what really happened on that night, including why the search party suddenly abandoned the creek bed, and including what you did when Aurora tried to show them. Frank stumbled backward, his eyes wide with a terror that sliced right through the alcoholic haze, a raw, sobering fear. You can't know that. How could you? Maggie's voice impossibly was still laced with a grandmother's sweetness. Get out, Frank. Some truths have to wait for the right season to be told, and this is not yours. He fled without another word, crashing through the door and back into the raging storm. Grace could hear his truck's engine sputter and fight the cold, then finally catch its sound, quickly swallowed by the howling wind. What did you say to him? Grace whispered. What truly happened that night? Maggie met her eyes, and in their depths, Grace saw a lifetime of secrets. Some stories don't belong to the one telling them, dear. Not yet, anyway. That dog in there, she has her reasons for clinging to that old bag. Frank has his reasons for trying to drown his own ghosts. And somewhere out in all this pain, a truth is waiting to surface. But not today. She gently patted Grace's arm. You just focus on keeping that dog safe. Protect those puppies. The rest will unfold when it's supposed to. She vanished as abruptly as she had appeared, leaving Grace with a storm of questions and no answers. Down in the recovery room, Aurora's panic had subsided. But the encounter had changed something deep within her. She had tucked the pink backpack underneath her body and was now lying on it like a mother hen guarding her only egg. She refused to take a bite unless Grace placed her food where the bag was always in view. At night, she would whimper and paw at it endlessly, arranging and rearranging it within her nest. Grace started doing the math. Aurora had likely been pregnant for 60 days. The gestation for a German Shepherd was 63. 3 more days, maybe less, given all the stress. She observed as Aurora nudged the backpack into position for the 100th time, her movements growing more frantic as her body prepared for birth. What are you trying to tell me? Grace whispered, sitting beside the kennel. Aurora looked up at her with those soulful amber eyes, then deliberately pushed the bag toward the kennel door, not surrendering it, but presenting it like a crucial piece of evidence in a trial only she understood. That's when Grace noticed something she had overlooked. The backpack wasn't just weathered. It had been repaired many times over. Clumsy, desperate stitches held old tears together. A strap had been carefully re-knotted where it had snapped. This bag had been maintained, treasured, and protected through 3 years of hell. Aurora had kept her promise. Whatever that promise truly meant, whatever unspeakable thing happened the night Emily disappeared, Aurora had never let go. Outside, the fury of the storm was escalating. The radio announced 12 dead across Texas, thousands without power, and roads that would be impassable for weeks. And inside a small veterinary clinic, a dog was preparing to give birth, all while clutching the last remnant of a child who had asked her to keep a promise. Grace couldn't get Maggie's words out of her head. Some truths need their time, but time for what? And for whom? And what truth could be so monstrous that even now, 3 years later, it still had the power to drain every bit of color from Frank Donovan's face? In the dim emergency lighting, the small pink backpack seemed to pulse with the weight of its secrets, and Aurora curled tighter around it, as if her body could somehow shield the past from the present, a sacred promise from a cold reality, a strange love born from loss. Grace couldn't shake the feeling. Not after Maggie's cryptic visit, not after Frank's drunken intrusion. She had to know the truth of what happened to Emily Donovan. The storm had sealed the world away. Roads were impassable. The internet was dead. There was nothing left but time and haunting questions. She uncovered an old laptop in her office holding downloaded newspaper archives from the county library's digitization project, a project she had ironically helped fund but never once used. The Austin Chronicle, February 15th, 2018. Local girl 7 presumed dead in ice storm. The headline was a blade cold and stark. A matter of fact, the detached way newspapers chronicle tragedies that have faded into statistics. Emily Marie Donovan, a second grader at Valley Elementary, had vanished during the brutal, unexpected ice storm that struck central Texas on February 14th. She was last seen playing with the family dog in her own backyard. The search was abandoned after a grueling 72 hours due to the perilous conditions. No body was ever recovered. Grace's eyes scanned further, and the effort had been massive, involving 40 volunteers, 2 helicopters, and sophisticated heat-sensing equipment. They had concentrated their efforts on Peterson Creek, where Emily's small backpack was found snagged on a branch. The water, swollen with snowmelt, was a frigid, rushing torrent. It was impossible for any child to survive. Frank Donovan was quoted his words, a hollow echo of grief. "She's gone. My baby's gone. The dog came back alone. That's all I need to know." But something was wrong. An oddity in the sheriff's report buried deep in the final paragraph. The family dog had desperately and repeatedly tried to lead the searchers away from the creek, pulling them toward the northern woods. This strange behavior was dismissed as a simple trauma response. Grace glanced at Aurora, sleeping restlessly in her cage, her paws still protectively wrapped around that very backpack. "You were trying to tell them, weren't you?" Grace whispered. "You knew she was never in the creek." The next few hours ignited into an investigation. Grace layered against the cold and pushed her way through the raging storm to the town library, which stood abandoned but miraculously unlocked. A silent testament to the way small towns hold on to trust. The physical newspaper archives were still there, their pages yellowed and thick with dust. She unearthed details the digital version had carelessly trimmed away. Photos from the search. Frank, 3 years younger, clean-shaven, his face a mask of desperation, but sober. A younger, healthier Aurora, straining against her leash, fighting with all her might to pull rescuers in one specific, ignored direction. And then she found it. A photograph that made Grace's hands tremble. A school portrait of Emily Donovan. A gap-toothed smile beamed from the photo, her lavender sweater. A perfect match for the scarf tucked inside the backpack. But it was the smaller photograph next to it that made Grace's heart stop cold. Emily and Aurora captured at Christmas, a haunting 2 months before she disappeared forever. The little girl's arms were clasped tightly around the dog's neck, her face buried deep within Aurora's protective fur. And beneath it, the caption, "Emily and her guardian angel Aurora, Christmas 2017. The words echoed in Grace's mind as she drove to the town's only diner. It was closed, but she knew Patricia Wilson, the owner, lived right upstairs. Patricia had run this place for 30 years. She knew every secret the town held. She finally answered the door, bundled in 3 heavy blankets, her breath pluming into the frigid air. "Grace, what on earth are you doing out in this weather?" Grace's voice was low and urgent. "I need to know about Frank Donovan, before Emily was gone." Patricia's expression shifted her features, softening with the profound sadness reserved for tragedies that utterly break good people. "Oh, Grace. Honey, why are you digging up all that pain?" Grace insisted. "I have Aurora, and I'm telling you there's something not right about any of this." Patricia sighed, preparing instant coffee on her small camping stove, the power having been out for days. "Frank, he was a different man back then. You wouldn't even recognize him now. He was the best father you could ever imagine. Him and Emily, they were an unbreakable team, especially after her mother was lost to cancer. Back when Emily was just 3, Frank didn't date, didn't drink, nothing. His entire world was his work and his daughter. He even built her a playhouse that was finer than most people's actual homes. He taught her how to use tools, how to build things with her own 2 hands. They brought Aurora home when Emily turned 4. For protection, he said. But the truth is, Emily had been begging for a puppy for 2 straight years. He couldn't deny her. Grace leaned in. "What happened to him after?" Patricia's voice dropped to a whisper. "What happens to any parent who loses their child?" Grace, he shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. But Frank, he didn't just break. He broke mean. He started drinking heavily the very day they called off the official search. Within a month, he'd lost his job. And then, he started blaming Aurora. He kept saying she was supposed to protect Emily, that it was the entire reason he'd gotten a German shepherd. The cruelty began subtly, first with the yelling, then throwing things, and from there it just got worse. No one could stop him. Patricia's gaze drifted away, filled with shame. "We tried. The sheriff went out there a few times. But Frank is clever, even when he's drunk. At first he never left marks where anyone would see. And that poor dog, she never once fought back. She never bit him, never even tried to run away. It was as if she believed she was doing penance for a failure only she understood. Those scars she carries on her back. There were 7. 1 for every year Emily was alive. He'd do it on her birthday every single year like some kind of twisted ceremony. He claimed it was to make Aurora remember what she'd stolen from him." Patricia dabbed at her tears. "We all knew the truth. The entire town knew, yet we stood by and did nothing. Because what could we do? Take the dog? Where would she even go? And Frank, somewhere buried deep inside that cruel, drunken shell, is the same man who once gave Emily piggyback rides right down Main Street." Next, Grace found her way to the Hendersons, Bob and Maggie Henderson. Though Bob could barely speak anymore, not since his stroke. But Maggie welcomed her inside a house kept warm by a wood-burning stove. "I figured you'd be coming by," Maggie said, easing into her recliner. "You want to know what I saw that night, don't you?" She paused. "I was right here, just like always. But this window, it shows me things." That night the storm rolled in so fast. Frank had been drinking, not stumbling drunk like he is now, but he'd had enough. He sent Emily outside to play with Aurora, said they'd be fine for a few minutes. Kids and dogs, they love the snow, right? But then, he fell asleep right on the couch. Maggie paused, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the window, beyond the current storm. I heard Aurora start barking. It wasn't a normal bark. It was the kind that tells you something is terribly wrong. It went on for maybe 20 minutes. And then silence. About an hour later, I saw Aurora back at Frank's door, pawing at it. She started barking again. Frank finally stumbled outside and realized Emily wasn't with her. That's when the chaos began. "But you mentioned there was more," Grace pressed. "Something about where they were searching." Maggie's eyes grew sharp. Aurora desperately tried to lead them north toward the woods, but Frank found Emily's backpack near the creek and became fixated on that spot. He refused to even consider looking anywhere else. When Aurora tried pulling the search party north on the second day, Frank struck her hard with a stick, right in front of everyone. He claimed she was confused, traumatized. The searchers just followed his lead. After all, he was the father. They scoured that creek for 3 whole days and never once went north. "Why didn't you say anything?" Grace asked. "Oh, I did. The sheriff told me that dogs can get disoriented from trauma." Frank told the whole town that Aurora had failed, that she'd let Emily wander off to the creek. Who's going to listen to an old woman over a grieving father? Grace was turning to leave when Maggie's hand shot out and gripped her arm. "There's one more thing. The morning after, before the search truly got underway, I discovered something in the snow. The tracks of adult boots not from around here, leading directly north. The afternoon snowfall nearly buried them, but I saw them plain as day. Someone else was out there in the wilderness. Drifters, I figured. We get them from time to time. People just passing through, especially the kind who prefer to remain unseen, camping out in the northern woods. But in a blizzard like that one, Maggie just shrugged. I reported it to the sheriff, but he brushed it off as hunters from before the storm hit. But hunters don't march in single file, and their steps don't carry that kind of relentless purpose. Back at the clinic, Grace uncovered something she'd completely missed. An old SD card tucked in the bottom of the backpack and carefully wrapped in plastic. Her laptop's battery was still alive, and when she slid the card in, 43 video files flickered onto the screen, all time-stamped between 2016 and February 2018. The very first video showed Aurora as an 8-week-old puppy tumbling all over Emily's lap. Emily couldn't have been more than 5 years old, a gap where her front teeth should be erupting in giggles as Aurora licked her face. "This here is my guardian angel," Emily announced to the camera with childhood certainty. "Daddy says she'll always protect me." Grace watched every single one. It was a moving chronicle of pure, unconditional love. Aurora growing from a clumsy puppy into an elegant young dog, Emily teaching her tricks, reading stories to her and using her as a warm pillow during movie nights. Frank's voice was a comforting presence occasionally heard from behind the camera, warm, loving, and whole. But one video from January of 2018 made Grace pause. Emily, now 7, was carefully brushing Aurora's thick fur. "You know what, Aurora? If something were to ever happen, if I got lost or scared, you would have to find me. Okay, promise me. Even if everyone else gives up, you won't give up, will you?" And then, as if sealing the pact, Aurora placed her paw right on Emily's hand. Emily hugged her with all her might. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky." The very last video was from February 13th, 2018. The day before, she disappeared. Emily was showing Aurora how to carry her little backpack. "See, you're so strong. You could carry my whole life in there." She'd carefully packed it with her treasures, the doll, her scarf, and a drawing she made for Aurora. "This is very important stuff, Aurora. Keep it safe." Grace was openly weeping now, alone in her office as the storm howled its fury against the windows. In that moment, she knew she was witnessing the last fragile moments of a perfect friendship before the world shattered it. She moved into the recovery room, where Aurora was already awake, her amber eyes fixed on Grace, holding a history too profound for words. Grace sank to the floor beside the cage, balancing her laptop on her knees. "Do you want to see her?" she asked, her voice a gentle whisper. She turned the screen toward the cage, and a video of Emily's singing filled the tense silence. Aurora's entire being shifted. Her ears pricked forward, her tail attempted a weak but hopeful wag, and from deep in her chest came a sound Grace had never heard before. It was part whine, part heartbroken cry, and wholly desperate. "I know," Grace murmured. "I know you tried. I know you never gave up." She found herself confessing, speaking words she had locked away for years. "I lost my daughter, too. Lily. She was 8. A reckless driver 3 days before Christmas 5 years ago. I understand the promise, Aurora. I know that crushing weight of failing to protect them, but you didn't fail. You were trying to tell them where she was. As if in response, Aurora nudged the backpack toward the cage door again. This time with more insistence. That's when Grace saw something new. Faint, deep scratches on the bottom of the bag, as if it had been dragged over rough ground again and again, as if Aurora had been carrying it on a desperate, repeating journey. You've been trying to take this somewhere, haven't you? For 3 long years, she whispered in dawning realization. You have been trying. Outside, the storm's fury intensified the only other sound, a crackling, battery-powered radio. The announcer's grim voice reported 23 dead across Texas. The National Guard was being mobilized, but roads would be impassable for a week at the very least. With a final cough and sputter, Grace's generator died. The backup battery system kicked in a lifeline of 8 hours of power, perhaps 12 if she was frugal. She made a decision right then. She moved her cot into the recovery room, creating a makeshift camp right beside Aurora's cage. If these puppies were born in this tempest, she had to be right there. No power meant no incubator, no heating pads. She would have to keep them warm the old way with her own body. Aurora watched her every move, and for the first time since Grace had found her, she saw the dog's tense body soften just slightly. It wasn't quite trust, but something deeper recognition. This human understood the weight of a promise. This human wouldn't give up either. Grace pulled the worn photograph from the backpack once more, studying it in the narrow beam of her flashlight. The water had bled the colors away, leaving only ghosts of memories, but through the damage she could still see traces. Emily's radiant smile, the soft texture of Aurora's fur, and there almost lost in the background a haunting image of what looked like northern trees, the very same direction Aurora had desperately tried to pull the rescue teams. What secrets did those woods hold, oh Aurora? What did you witness? In response, Aurora only coiled herself tighter around the worn backpack, her body shaking with a tremor that went deeper than the biting cold. Her puppies would be here soon. Grace recognized the unmistakable signs. The frantic nesting, the shifting cadence of her breath, her gaze turning inward to a world only she could see. But even as the powerful instincts of motherhood took over, Aurora's gaze remained locked on that faded pink backpack, on the silent vow she had honored for 3 agonizing years through cruelty and abandonment, through 7 scars and beatings too numerous to count. She had never let go. She had never surrendered, never stopped trying to fulfill a 7-year-old girl's last request to keep her safe. Grace slowly reached her hand through the cold bars of the cage, her fingers gently brushing against Aurora's head. "When this storm finally breaks," she whispered, "and when you have your strength back, we're going to those woods. We are going to uncover the truth you've been so desperate for everyone to see. I promise you." Aurora lifted her head, her eyes meeting Grace's. And in those deep amber pools, Grace saw the one thing 3 years of failure could not extinguish: hope. It was a fragile, exhausted hope, yet it burned with an unwavering light, a prayer that someone would finally hear her, finally understand. Finally help her fulfill her sacred promise to Emily. Outside, the blizzard howled its fury against the clinic's walls as the temperature continued its deadly descent, a lethal sheet of ice encasing every single surface. Texas was suffocating under the winter's brutal assault. Yet in this small, warm shelter, new life was preparing to emerge. Aurora's puppies would be born into a world of unforgiving ice and shadows, but it was also a world where promises still held weight, where love endured against all reason, and where a dog's devotion could survive the absolute wreckage of everything else. Grace settled in, preparing for the long, tense vigil ahead. She knew with a chilling certainty that when the storm finally passed, when the puppies were born, when the truth was at last dragged from the shadows, nothing would ever be the same. Some transformations tear through your life like a storm, but others, the ones that change you forever, are born from promises kept in the deepest darkness, just waiting for someone to finally bring them into the light. The 14th of February descended with a fury that made the preceding days feel like a quiet prelude. The storm had unleashed its monstrous heart. Winds howled at 70 miles an hour. Ice was encasing the world at a rate Texas was never meant to endure. For 36 relentless hours, Grace had been awake, a tireless guardian watching over Aurora, parceling out the last dregs of battery power, fighting to keep the encroaching cold at bay with blankets and her own fading warmth. At 3:47 in the morning, precisely 3 years to the very hour that Emily vanished, Aurora's water broke, and from that very first moment, everything was terribly wrong. The fluid wasn't clear. It was stained with blood more than there should have been, just enough to make every veterinary instinct inside Grace scream out in alarm. Aurora's breaths turned into ragged, desperate gasps. She was panicking, the whites of her eyes showing as a wave of pain far greater than normal labor seized her. "Easy, girl. Easy," Grace whispered, her voice a fragile anchor in the storm. Her hands were already moving gently, examining, and what she found sent a cold dread plummeting through her. The first puppy was breached. It was stuck, and worse, Aurora was hemorrhaging. As if orchestrated by some cruel fate, the battery backup chose that exact instant to emit its final piercing beep. 3 minutes of power remained. Grace fumbled for her emergency flashlight, jamming it between her shoulder and cheek to cast a desperate beam as she worked. The dancing shadows thrown by the beam transformed the room into a primitive cave, a place of imminent and primal danger. Aurora's body was racked by contractions coming too fast, far too strong. Grace knew she had no choice but to try and reposition the puppy by hand, her own hands miraculously steady in the heart of the chaos. Aurora screamed a sound so raw there was no other name for it, and beneath Grace's fingers she felt the puppy shift. One final agonizing push, and suddenly the puppy was there sliding into her waiting hands. A little male, and he wasn't breathing. "Come on, oh come on," Grace pleaded, rubbing the tiny body, vigorously clearing his airways and breathing her own life into his small nostrils. For a heart-stopping moment there was nothing, still nothing. And then, a gasp, a fragile cry. He was breathing. In the unsteady beam of the flashlight, Grace saw something that made her entire body go cold. There on his forehead, as clear as if painted by an artist, was a perfect white marking in the shape of a star. Aurora saw it too. Pushing through her agony, she reached for her newborn, licking him with a desperate energy. And then something shifted. For the first time since the day Grace found her, she intentionally nudged the small pink backpack toward Grace with her nose, no longer clutching it, not protecting it, but offering it. "You want me to look now?" Grace thought, as Aurora's deep, knowing eyes locked with hers, and her eyes held something far deeper than pain, something more than animal instinct. It was a silent, urgent plea mingled with an unwavering trust, as if she was trying to tell Grace something critically important, something that couldn't wait. Once the puppy was nestled safely against Aurora's belly, Grace reached for the backpack. She had gone through it before, but only in the dim light, relying more on touch than sight. Now her fingers brushed against something she had overlooked, a concealed zipper sewn into the inner lining. Within it she found a plastic bag, and inside the bag, oh God, it was a medical alert bracelet, one made for a child, the type designed never to be removed. The engraving was clear: Emily Donovan, blood type, O negative, severe allergy to penicillin, and etched at the bottom was a tracking number for the bracelet's registration. But that wasn't all. Tucked alongside it was a folded piece of paper, the handwriting completely different from the child's scrawl. This was an adult script, hurried, desperate. "Found her in the snow. She was barely alive. I can't go to a hospital. I have warrants. I'm taking her to Oklahoma to my sister. She'll be safe there. Tell no one. The dog, it wouldn't leave her. It just kept following. I had to drive fast to lose her, God forgive me." Grace's hands trembled. Emily might still be alive. She had been alive when she was taken. Oklahoma. The dog had known all along she had tried to follow. and had protected this evidence for all this time. Just then, another contraction tore through Aurora, snapping Grace back to the crisis at hand. The second puppy was on its way, but Aurora was now bleeding heavily, her body temperature plummeting, despite the warmth of the room. Grace moved on autopilot, delivering the second puppy, a female perfectly healthy, who began crying the moment she was born. Then came a third, another male. But Aurora was fading fast, her breaths becoming shallow as a pool of blood spread beneath her. It was then that the clinic door burst open, unleashing a whirlwind of snow, and with it, Frank Donovan. He stood silhouetted in the doorway like a ghost from a bad dream. There was ice clinging to his beard and the smell of bourbon on his breath, but his eyes were stone cold, sobered by a terrible grief. "It's the anniversary," he choked out, his voice shattered. 3 years ago to this very minute I woke up because Aurora was barking. 3 years ago I was just realizing that my baby was gone. His gaze fell upon Aurora then, to the blood, the newborn puppies, the raw battle between life and death unfolding on his clinic floor. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "What's happening?" "She's dying," Grace answered bluntly, her hands never ceasing their work to staunch the hemorrhage. "She's losing too much blood. Without help, we're going to lose her. And the puppies." For a beat, Frank was frozen in place. Then the mask he wore began to crack. The alcoholic haze vanished from his eyes. In its place stood the man who once built a life with his own 2 hands. "Just tell me what to do. Hold this pressure right here, and don't you dare let go." Grace guided his hands firmly onto Aurora's abdomen. "Press hard, harder than you think is safe." As Frank's hands made contact, Aurora's eyes fluttered open, and Grace braced for a look of terror, but what she saw instead was recognition. And then against all odds, Aurora's tail gave the faintest twitch. It wasn't a wag, just a silent acknowledgement. And with that, Frank's fragile composure shattered. "I'm so sorry." He choked out, his tears freezing on his cheeks. "God, I am so sorry. I know you were trying to show us where she was. I was too lost in my own pain to see." The fourth puppy arrived in a sudden violent rush of blood that stained the floor a deep crimson. Grace moved with frantic urgency, delivering the newborn while desperately fighting the hemorrhage. The puppy, another female, wasn't breathing. Grace tried everything, but after 5 long minutes, she had to accept the loss. As if she knew, Aurora whimpered softly. "There are more," Grace said, her voice tight, feeling the contractions ripple through Aurora's womb. "At least 3 more, but if she keeps bleeding like this..." "She'll make it?" Frank interrupted, his voice filled with a sudden, fierce belief. "She's never given up on anything. Not on Emily, not even on me. And God knows I gave her every reason to." As if in response, Aurora's gaze sharpened with purpose. Her eyes met Frank's, then shifted to Grace, and finally settled on the open backpack where the flashlight beam caught the glint of the medical bracelet. Her message was unmistakable. "You know now. You finally understand." The 5th puppy slid out more easily, as if Aurora's body had drawn strength from that shared understanding. Then came the 6th, both healthy, their tiny cries filling the frigid air. "But the 7th... it's stuck," Grace whispered. "And she's too weak for me to..." A deep rumble echoed from Aurora's chest. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of pure, unyielding will. She bore down with a force that should have been impossible, and the last puppy, the smallest of them all, a female, slipped into the world. But the effort had cost Aurora everything. Her heart rate plummeted. Her breaths became a final, ragged struggle for air. "No," Frank pleaded, his hands still locked in place exactly where Grace had put them. "No, you don't get to leave us now. Not yet. Not when there's finally hope." That single word hung in the tense air, hope. Grace seized the medical bracelet, holding it directly in Aurora's line of sight. Emily could still be alive. "Aurora, you did this. You protected the only proof. We have a chance to find her because of you." Aurora's weary gaze drifted to the bracelet, then to her newborn pups nursing at her belly, oblivious to the chaos.